Thank you very much. Thanks. It's an honor to be here at the Academy in this very grand room, in this grand setting. I hope you can hear me, and if there's any problem with the acoustics, just try and wave your hand and let me know somehow. Thanks to the organizers and to Efi in particular for the invitation and for her hospitality here in Athens. I've been coming to Athens for many years, and it's always a great pleasure to be back here, and especially honored to be speaking to you this afternoon. Dionysus believed that his greatest conquest was in India. We know as much because the Greeks and Romans tell us that the god celebrated his victory against the Indians by leading a triumphant procession back to Greece, complete with satyrs, maenads, drinking, song, and wild animals. The invasion and the triumph were the stuff of legend, the more so because they were duly connected to the expedition of Alexander the Great. In the Roman period, emperors attempted to emulate both Alexander and Dionysus, and the president of the Dionysiac, Alexander, was frequently recalled in art and text. In this milieu, Lucian's Dionysus is a fascinating text, since it offers us a humorous interpretation of Dionysus' invasion of India and Indian reactions to the event. The text prompts its readers to reflect on Alexander's Dionysiac self-fashioning, especially in South Asia, and not least to ask after Indian reactions to Dionysus. It so happens that what we might arguably term Indian responses to Dionysus also can be perceived in other ways, since Dionysiac images survive in some quantity from Bactria and Gandhara, regions that Alexander and the Greeks thought of as India. The images date to a period that is roughly contemporaneous with Lucian's lifetime, and in their own terms also explore the relationship between Dionysus and India. I would not like to suggest that these Gandharan representations of Dionysus are somehow more truly or more authentically reflective of how and what Indians thought of the god than Lucian's text. These depictions of the god are no less partial and no less culturally and politically mediated than the many Greek and Roman texts and images of Dionysus, and we should read them no less carefully than the other. But I think reflecting on Lucian and the Gandharan images together gives us a worthwhile opportunity to think comparatively about Dionysus and to inquire into the issue of religious translation. In this context, the word translation has at least three partly overlapping connotations. The first is linguistic and refers to translation from one language to another. The second is geographical and refers to the displacement of the god from one part of the world to another. The third is religious and refers to varying conceptions of religion, divinity, and belief across cultures. There are, of course, other issues raised by the translation of Dionysus from the Mediterranean to Gandhara, and I hope that we shall be able to address them this afternoon. Let's begin with Lucian. Surely there is nothing to prevent my telling you a tale of Bacchus, Lucian says in his short prolalia on the god Dionysus, and in fact this is how he begins. When Dionysus led his host against the Indians, surely there is nothing to prevent my telling you a tale of Bacchus. He was held at first in such contempt, they say, by the people there, that they laughed at his advance. More than that, they pitied him for his hardihood, because he was certain to be trampled underfoot in an instant by the elephants if he deployed against him. No doubt they heard curious reports about his army from their scouts. His rank and file are crack-brained, crazy women, wreathed with ivy, dressed in fawn skins, carrying little headless spears which are of ivy too, and light targes that boom if you do but touch them. For they suppose, no doubt, that the tambourines, were shields. This highly original account of the god's invasion of India offers its audience a colourful description of Dionysus and his followers, of Indian condescension toward the god, and of the god's triumph over the Indians. In a subtle gesture near the beginning, the narrator wonders, what must the Indians have thought of the strange god and his army of crazy women and young clodhoppers dancing the can-can without any clothes on? I'm following the translation of the Lord here. He goes on to describe how the Indians failed to take the god seriously, in part since Dionysus rides in a chariot drawn by panthers and wears clusters of grapes, a ribbon in his hair, a purple gown and golden slippers, and how they decline to defend their land against him, much to their own detriment. To the bewilderment of critics, the last section of the work switches focus and consists of a story set near the banks of the river Indus about the amazing effects of the water from 3 springs on men of different ages. There's a great deal of literary complexity in Lucian's short prologue, as many readers have seen, but what is interesting for our purposes is the depiction of Dionysus in an Indian context. Lucian is, I think, lampooning Alexander's conquest of India and narratives of that event by offering his readers a witty, knowing version of the conflict. Lucian does not mention Alexander or the Alexander historians by name in his work, but in the story about the 3 springs he mentions the tribe of Machlaioi. Among the Machlaioi Indians who feed their flocks on the left banks of the Indus River as you look downstream and to reach clear to the ocean, in their country there is a grove in an enclosed place of no great size. It is completely sheltered, however, for rank ivy and grapevines overshadow it quite. In it there are 3 springs of fair, clear water. One belongs to the satyrs, another to Pan, the third to Silenus. The Indians visit the place once a year, celebrating the feast of the god, and they drink from the springs. The word Machlaioi occurs nowhere else in Greek literature, and H.G. Nesselrod has wondered whether that term is a garbled reminiscence of Maloi, one of the tribes that Alexander is said to have fought against in the Indian campaign. The word may also contain an allusion to maklos, which means lewd or lustful, in which case there is a further joke or pun in Lucian's story about the springs that exert a mysterious effect on Indian men. Even without the wordplay, however, we know the stories of Alexander's invasion were in circulation in the author's era, and a writer as versed in letters as Lucian would doubtless have been familiar with the accounts of the expedition to India. The register of Lucian's work is difficult to gauge, but to me at least the satire extends to post-Alexandrian generals and politicians who, conscious of the achievements of Alexander, launched expeditions against distant lands. Lucian deflates the pretensions of these men by drawing a comparison with Maenads, satyrs, and sirens. Dionysus had the center in person. Silenus commanded on the right wing and Pan on the left. The satyrs were commissioned as colonels and captains, and the general watchword was Evoe. In a trice, the tambours were beat, the cymbals gave the signal for battle. One of the satyrs took his horn and sounded the charge. Silenus's jackass gave a martial hee-haw, and the Maenads, serpent-girdled, bearing the steel of their thyrsus points, fell on with a shriek. The Indians and the elephants gave way at once and fled in utter disorder, not even daring to get within range. The outcome was that they were captured by force of arms and led off prisoners by those whom they had formerly laughed at, taught by experience that strange armies should not have been despised on hearsay. Military leaders were ripe for parody, since Alexander and Dionysus together had been appropriated by a string of powerful rulers from the Ptolemies onward in the context of universal empire and political power that inspired the first literary treatments of Dionysus in the post-Alexander mode. Trajan and Hadrian were merely 2 of the many enthusiastic imperial supporters of Dionysus of whom Lucian would have heard, and he is probably puncturing the vanities of all rulers who thought themselves worthy heirs to the Dionysiac Alexander. The Indians in Lucian's text are not spared the sharp edge of his wit either, and he pokes fun at them by showing them to be complacent and no match even for a ragtag bunch of soldiers. The chief fault of the Indians appears to be that, like Pentheus and the Bacchae and many others, they fail to take the power of Dionysus seriously, and they are routed easily by the god and his merry band of soldiers. Brannan has read the work in terms of estrangement in Shklovsky's sense of the concept, but the estrangement is relatively contained and not as developed, say, as in Montesquieu's Persian letters or in Tolstoy's novels. The Indians' views of Dionysus and his followers are drawn largely from long-established Greek or Roman patterns, so the Greek or Roman reader scarcely comes away from the text with a heightened or altered awareness of the god. What we do find in the text are fairly standard descriptions of the beardless god and his attire, of Silenus and Pan, of the Maenads, of Bacchic dancing, and homophagia. One of the points that Lucian does make, subtly in his text, is that the invasion of India by Dionysus introduces Indians to the worship of the god in his many facets. The Matlai, or Indians, as you heard earlier, celebrate the feast of the god once a year in a grove sheltered by ivy and grapevine. The ivy and the vine are tokens of Dionysiac worship, but also markers of Mediterranean culture here as elsewhere. Just as Alexander is occasionally said to have dispersed Hellenism across the territories that he brought under his control, Dionysus and his entourage introduced memorials of Mediterranean culture and civilization in the lands of their conquest. In his Strategemata, Polyaenus, who is a rough contemporary of Lucian, writes that Dionysus intoxicates his enemies with wine, and several writers state that wine especially is one of the indicators of civilization that Dionysus takes with him to India. The wine is not the only thing brought to India by Dionysus, and Lucian implies, as do writers such as Diodorus and Arrian in his Indice, that Dionysus also teaches the land to dance. Thanks to Dionysus, men, women, and satyrs revel together to the accompaniment of drums and cymbals. In the post-Alexandrian narrative of the triumph, Dionysus follows in the tracks of Alexander to India, and together with his army of Maenads and satyrs, he brings markers of culture such as wine and wheat and the Bacchic revel. Some readers have suggested that Lucian's interest in Dionysus in India actually derives from the author's own position as an outsider. On this reading, Lucian sought assimilation in much the way that Dionysus sought recognition, and was warning his readers not to mock him for his own exotic novelties. According to one critic, Lucian would certainly have distinctive facial characteristics that would differentiate him from the Western population of the empire, and that could constitute a reason for ostracism. I'm not sure that we can comment meaningfully on Lucian's facial characteristics or his appearance, nor do I think we can claim, as some have, that he resembles Dionysus, his entourage, and his accoutrement. The ironic tone of the piece also makes it unclear whether Lucian is inviting his readers to notice an affinity between him and the god on the grounds of shared exclusion. We cannot even assume that the author and narrator have the same proclivities or backgrounds. The story of the Three Springs, in fact, foregrounds the issue of interpretive difficulty, and the narrator explicitly refuses to draw a moral from it. That Lucian, who was from Samosata on the banks of Euphrates, was interested in questions of cross-cultural interaction is not in doubt. We need only look at works such as Anacharsis and On the Syrian Goddess in order to recall his engagement with non-Greek and non-Roman figures. In the case of Dionysus, we have a text in which a foreigner from Roman Syria writes in Greek for an elite audience in the empire about the reaction of Indians to a Greek god who, from the classical period, has been famously associated with non-Greek regions in the East, including India itself. We might rephrase this to say that a writer who comes from outside the metropolis refers in a highly cultured language to a people, Indians, who are far more marginal to the center than his own nation, Syria. If the relationship between author and culture seems complicated, the language and tone of the work also make interpretation of the text a challenge. As Simon Golden says of Lucian, he slyly allows his authorial stance, his foreignness, his commitment to Greek culture, further to vein his cultural politics with a destabilizing irony. In short, the cultural, linguistic, and political features of the text are multifaceted, and to say simply that Lucian's text is a Roman or a Greek account of Dionysus in India is to underplay the richness of the work. The relationship between Dionysus and India is of course not a theme that is original to Lucian. As we well know, the triumph of Dionysus becomes especially popular in visual culture during the early Roman Empire and remains so for several generations. It's one of the most frequently represented subjects on Roman sarcophagi of the 1st and 2nd century AD, the triumph of Dionysus. With the result that in the 4th century, Pacatus advises artists to avoid the subject for being too cliched. Despite Pacatus' advice, the Indian triumph continues to be of interest in Lucian's own homeland as late as the mid-500s, a point that is illustrated by this ivory pyxis, which is likely to have been made in Syria. The triumph of Dionysus is particularly well attested closer to Lucian's era on cameos. I use the word cameos in the material sense, that is to say, a small precious stone with figures carved in relief. This subject is well attested, the triumph of Dionysus is well attested closer to Lucian's era on cameos of the later Hellenistic and early Roman period. That is to say, the 2nd century BC to the 1st AD, and on stone sarcophagi, mainly of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. And here we have a cameo showing us Dionysus on a chariot on the left from the 1st century BC, and on the right, the triumph of Dionysus on that sarcophagus from the 2nd century CE. I hope you can make out the triumph on the sarcophagus from where you're sitting. You can probably make out the elephant towards the middle of that image on the bottom panel. There are various other animals and people there who are part of the triumph of Dionysus. We'll come back to that cameo again. There's no need for us to revisit all the images again this afternoon, and it will suffice for us to point to a well-known example such as this cameo, which arguably dates to the 1st century, and this marble sarcophagus, which is dated to the period of Lucian's old age or just after his death. Both of these objects show motifs such as the vine that are familiar to us as a part of Dionysiac iconography. These signs of the Dionysiac life, including the vine, Maenad, satyrs, scenes of drinking and revelry, all also appear in Kushan art of the 1st 2 or 3 centuries AD. That is, an art from the very regions that Alexander conquered in and around northwest India. I hope you can see on that map Gandhara and Bactria there. So I'll be talking mainly about Bactria and the region of Bactria. The larger region, which encompasses Bactria as well as Gandhara, is known as Greater Gandhara, and most scholars talk of Greater Gandhara as encompassing several of those towns in and around the region, specifically of Gandhara in a more narrow sense. This region of Greater Gandhara is, by the way, not to be, excuse me, let me rephrase that. The region of Gandhara in the narrow sense is not to be associated with the Bactria in which the Indo-Greeks settled after the age of Alexander. So immediately after Alexander, Greek soldiers settled in the region of Bactria. And Ai-Khanum is a famous city that's been excavated, and excavators there in Afghanistan have found various instances of material culture that have been interpreted as Greek or Hellenistic or Hellenic in some fashion, hybrid or otherwise. But these Indo-Greeks and Ai-Khanum as well, and Indo-Greek culture comes to an end roughly by 150 BCE or so by the middle of the 2nd century BC. And we're now going to be moving slightly forward to the 1st and 2nd century AD. So we're going to be jumping forward from the time of the last of the Indo-Greeks. We're moving to this Kushan culture, and by this point, as I say, Ai-Khanum and the Indo-Greeks have ceased to survive. This is a region, though, where there are traces of Greek, Iranian, Chinese, and Indian art, and these traces are attested in abundance. And the Dionysiac Greek features on these images coexist alongside themes that scholars have traced to the diverse cultures that shaped the artistic and political life of Bactria and Gandhara and the Kushan period. The multicultural nature of the images is worth stressing. But whatever the artists have to say of their own cultural identity, and however wide the range of traditions on which they draw, they nonetheless make a place for the Dionysiac in their images. One study published in 2005 estimates, with impressive precision, the number of pieces of Gandharan sculpture in museums worldwide at 1,439, of which 33.4% are said to show at least one Greco-Roman element, and of these, again, a small percentage can be deemed Dionysiac. Now, I don't know how they arrived at this precise calculation, but this is a published scholarly estimate. The Dionysiac and other Greek motifs are no less remarkable because ancient Gandhara also appears to be the site of Buddhism from the 2nd century BCE, if not earlier. The earliest Buddhist sculpture in Gandhara dates to the 1st century CE and coincides with the appearance of what we might term Greek features in Gandharan art. By this time, the Kushans, who were nomads from Central Asia, had assumed control of Bactria and Gandhara and much of northern India. There is some debate as to where the Hellenic influences come from, but the most plausible view is that the blossoming of Gandharan Buddhist art is connected both to the legacy of Hellenism from the Indo-Greek kingdoms in Bactria and also to trade with the Roman Empire. In a loose sense, therefore, Lucian has in common with the artists of early Gandhara that they are belated inheritors of Hellenism. Just as Lucian expresses his Romano-Syrian identity in classicizing Greek, so the artists of Gandhara express their local identity through the use of Dionysiac and other features. Greek and Roman representations of Dionysus, especially after the era of Alexander, show him as a god at large, a deity who ranges under the open sky, a general who goes to war and brings wine and civilization to India. But in the art of Greater Gandhara, Dionysus is not shown at the head of an extended army, and images of his conquests are absent. Here we have a schist relief. Schist is a kind of rock material substance from the 1st, 2nd century CE. There's a garland holder there on the left, and another relief again on the bottom right from Gandhara, dated to the 2nd and 3rd century CE. For whatever reason, Dionysus and the Dionysiac appear in abundance, but the subject of invasion, and as we shall see, the triumph, did not appeal to the artists in the area, whether they were Greeks, descended from Greeks, or unrelated by blood to Greeks altogether. Perhaps the forms of early Buddhism that flourished in Gandhara were not congenial to depictions of conquest, even in a parodic mode, although other representations of the Dionysiac are thick on the ground. Or perhaps the martial link between Alexander and Dionysus was reconfigured, attenuated, or absent altogether. Like Lucian, however, the artists of Bactria and Gandhara emphasized the maenads, satyrs, music, intoxication, and revelry, arguably the afterlife, and these are the figures and scenes they choose to portray in their art. Here are a couple of stair risers on these schist reliefs from Gandhara, dated to the 1st, 2nd century CE. Stair risers are the vertical part of stairs when you go up a stairway, so the vertical part between the horizontal steps. On a stupa, that would have been illustrated with these images. I use the word stupa. In some cases, the identification of these objects is controversial. Some people believe they're stupas, and some people don't go along with that identification. The god had come back home to the land of his birth. There was nowhere else to go, no lands to conquer, no need for a mission to bring civilization to anyone. Drinking, wine, dancing, revelry, and the theatre. For these activities there was time, and in them Dionysus was willing as ever to play his part. Dionysus plays his part in Gandhara with Heracles and a range of Greek and local figures, mortal, divine, and semi-divine. Heracles is also said to be frequently attested in these Gandhara images. There's also other Greek figures who are said to be in Gandhara art. The British Museum has a very famous image of Atlas, for instance, holding up the world in Gandharan art. In the early Kushan period, as I said, local artists do not see Greco-Roman classicism as a barrier, but take over some of its most distinctive images and symbols, and Dionysus becomes part of a culture in which a compelling fusion of foreign styles gives visual form to Buddhist religious ideals. Why it does so is an interesting question. This is another stair riser with the Dionysiac scene. I think you can make out the dancing and the revelry and arguably the music playing as well. I agree largely with Maurizio today's suggestion that Gandharan sculpture is to be considered as the art of few social groups that needed a foreign model, enabling them to distinguish themselves from the majority of the population. Dionysus and Dionysian features serve the interest of some political and cultural elite, or else they would not have persisted so vibrantly in Gandhara. Let us turn to a couple of objects that come from Bactria, that is from inside the greater Gandhara area during the period of Kushan rule. Consider this pair of gold clasps that were found in Tilya Tepe in Bactria in northern Afghanistan, and that date to the early Kushan period in about the 1st century CE. The clasps, which are mirror images of each other, show Dionysus. We think Dionysus is probably the figure closer to the front, and Ariadne, seated on a beast, a lion perhaps, while Silenus reclines at their feet. Behind Dionysus and Ariadne appears the figure of Victory, Nike. You can probably make out the figure there, behind the two of them, riding the animal, who appears to be crowning the two with a wreath. John Boardman writes that the clasps are a celebration of the god, his wine, and his marriage, and observes that the Ariadne figure has become naturalized in the East, a new Roxanne for Dionysus Alexander. He considers at length whether the scene is a Dionysiac triumph, but ultimately even he seems to discern no more than a hint of the triumph in the image. For Boardman, it looks as though the whole golden group was devised by an artist well aware of Greek, Dionysiac, and other iconography, but ready to make original combinations which would have looked strange but not impossible in a Mediterranean context, but which then or later were far less unusual in an Indian context. The scene on the gold clasps poses difficult questions about the legacy of a Dionysiac Alexander in Bactria, where the clasps were excavated. The association with death and the afterlife that we see on sarcophagi in Rome finds here a loose counterpart with the clasps which were found in graves. The clasps belong to a woman who was buried in one of the graves with royal paraphernalia and with several other Greek objects, including a coin in her mouth as a kind of payment to Charon. Boardman speculates she was an Indo-Greek princess in the royal household of the king of Emshi-Tepe. That an Indo-Greek royal family was seeking a connection with Greek culture is scarcely surprising, even in a region that was open to influences from the south and the east. Nor is the royal family's desire to forge an association with Dionysus, a god who is so frequently compared to Alexander in the Hellenistic world and in South Asia. Alexander was a complex forefather to many of the Indo-Greek rulers of an earlier era, as we know from the coinage, but many of them identified with him as a Greek benefactor and conqueror and not as an oppressive colonizer. From that perspective, the representation of Dionysus in the burial site of a royal princess is consistent with the ideology that we might expect to find among the aristocratic descendants of Indo-Greeks in Bactria. Dionysus also seems to appear in a silver bowl, the recovery of which reminds us of the region's entanglement with modern as well as ancient colonialism. This is in the British Museum. The plate is said to have belonged to the Hazara Mirs of Badakhshan, who, like many other rulers in the region, said they were descendants of Alexander. In the 19th century, the plate was acquired in Kunduz in northern Afghanistan, ancient Bactria, by a British administrator who passed it on to Alexander Burns. Bukhara Burns, whose adventures and death during the fall of Kabul in 1841 are now celebrated by historians, noted that the bowl represents the triumphal procession of the Grecian Bacchus and is of exquisite workmanship. He transmitted it to the Indian Museum in Calcutta, from where in turn it was handed over to the British Museum by the India Office in 1900. Burns was one of a number of British soldier administrators in the region who entertained fantasies of following in Alexander's footsteps, and the bowl's history thus illustrates the long legacy of Alexander in Afghanistan. The story of Alexander's legacy in Afghanistan is, of course, fascinating, and several scholars have written on this very topic. Pierre Briand has written extensively on it. Chris Hageman, others, myself included, have made small contributions to this subject as well. But it's a fascinating subject in its own right. The movements of Alexander in Afghanistan and the attraction that he held for subsequent colonials, colonizers, invaders, travelers, administrators in that region over centuries. That it is Bactria from where the silver dish was acquired by British administrators also affirms to us the attraction of Hellenic art to the region's inhabitants in earlier centuries. What seems important is that the dish adapts or reworks important elements of Dionysiac scenes, as we know these from other contexts, and puts them into circulation in North Indian or Central Asian lands. This is the dish now and the cameo that we looked at earlier side by side. The point for the artist was not to offer a triumph as with the cameo, but rather a cross-cultural prospect with Dionysiac elements in it. The scene is arguably more restful than in the earlier cameo, and the leftward movement has given way to an image of repose. The various figures are somewhat disconnected from the reclining God in the center. I'm talking now about the silver dish on the right. And the idea of a procession, if it is there at all, is subdued. The winged Psyche, Sukai, are not pulling the chariot, and Eros is not guiding them forward. Yet the figures and details certainly contribute to the Dionysiac nature of the scene. Eros holding a jug, the other Eros flying above, the cart on which the central figure reclines, the small woman sitting on the corner of the cart, the satyr standing on one leg behind the cart, the vine on the upper right. You can probably make it out above the reclining figure's head. The panther at the bottom, the very bottom there, the panther at the bottom who seems to be peering into a vessel. This is a Dionysiac image, but without the elements of triumph that we see in the cameo and in other representations. This man is not traveling back to Greece in a victory procession with or without Ariadne by his side. He is already where he wants to be, and that is in India. These particular cases of Dionysiac art can be set against what may be termed a general receptivity to the Dionysiac across many generations in the local hybrid cultures of Bactria and Gandhara. Scholars have looked for signs of the Dionysiac in viniculture, viticulture, festivals surrounding the making and drinking of wine, singing, dancing, music, and theatre, and arguably have located evidence for these activities in the region. There is indeed a large body of archaeological material that points to winemaking and wine drinking in Gandhara from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century CE. As for drama, archaeologists have discovered the remains of a theatre at Ai-Khanum in northern Afghanistan, together with the gymnasium, fountain, and funerary mountains, and also many structures that do not conform to older Hellenic patterns. It's worth observing, as I said earlier, that Ai-Khanum was destroyed in about 150 BCE, whereas the material from Gandhara that we've been discussing comes from a later date. The scholars Pia Brancaccio and Shinru Liu have discerned a Dionysian dramatic ethos in the Sanskrit writings of Ashvaghosha, a dramatist and poet from Gandhara who lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. In arguing that in Bactria and Gandhara, traces of Dionysian dramatic performances are ubiquitous, these scholars refer to the remnants of the theatre at Ai-Khanum and to this fragment of a vessel from the 1st century CE in which Dionysus is said to be the figure in the center, flanked by a Maenad in an animal skin on the left and another woman on the right who is embracing him. The curator of the fragment writes that this delicately carved scene is set before a type of curtain that in the West would be associated with theatre. Brancaccio and Liu marshal many other pieces of evidence in support of their claim that a long-established presence of Greco-Roman theatrical traditions and Dionysian culture pervaded the arts of the Kushan period. It may be possible to go through all the evidence and analyze it in its particularity, but let us postpone the controversial question of Greco-Roman theatrical influence to another occasion. For the moment, I'd like to draw your attention to the cultural irony of the persistence of Dionysiac motifs in the art of Bactria and Gandhara, since the god of Dionysus himself is said to have arisen in the area. Lucian is evidently not an exception in this respect. As early as the 5th century BC, Euripides already shows Dionysus arriving in Greece from Bactria and Asia. The historians of Alexander, such as Arrian, Diodorus, and Strabo, connect Dionysus to India through birth or conquest or both, and they ascribe some of these stories even to Indian sources. Gandharan artists are thus creatively assimilating Greco-Roman narratives that cast Dionysus and his adventures in the area on the basis of native information. From this perspective, Indian artists are not importing a foreign god into their own work, but representing a deity whom Greek and Roman traditions depicted as Indian from an early date. No Indian text mentions Dionysus or his birth or his triumph, nor does any liken him to Shiva, to whom he is compared in the modern period. This is not to say that the Gandharan artists are simply parroting Greek or Roman ideas about Dionysus and Indian religious beliefs and mechanically reproducing them in metal or stone. It is more helpful, I believe, to think of these artists as creatively adapting, using, and reformulating Dionysiac images, ideas, and motifs. They are, after all, crafting their work in a Kushan Buddhist environment and may well be fusing Dionysus with a regional figure or set of figures in the process. But these varied images, ideas, and motifs, referred at some level to the god's regional birth and adventures, may have added to the appeal of the theme. The notion of the native-born god, of course, would not by itself account for the popularity of the Dionysiac theme, but it may explain the enduring reaffirmation of Dionysiac themes, however acculturated and defined in Gandhara, and it might also explain why indigenous groups use Dionysus to enhance their own cultural, economic, and political status. What happens to a god in translation? The subject of Dionysus and Gandhara is clearly fraught, difficult, and complicated. We might even ask ourselves whether it is appropriate to refer to this figure as Dionysus and to the associated motifs as Dionysiac. Over long decades of scholarship, we have learned to think of the ancient gods separately on their own merits, to insist on their local and regional peculiarities, not to assimilate their rituals, worship, and cult practices. A literary Dionysus may differ from a philosophical Dionysus, who may differ in turn from an artistic Dionysus. A 5th century Athenian Dionysus is not the same as an Hellenistic Dionysus or a Roman Libra. If we need to respect the singularity of the Greek or Roman Dionysus, then we should not be too hasty to assimilate Gandhara images to some traditive canon formed further to the west in lands adjoining the Mediterranean. Even if we could locate the Sanskrit or Pali text and refer to Dionysus, we would need a great deal more than just the name to understand what the other reference, what the inhabitants of the place thought about it, whether they thought of it as a god, and which particular Greek or Roman Dionysus they were over. One might easily imagine a whole series of intractable and challenging questions that such a reference raises. A related problem for scholars who write about Dionysus and Gandhara is that the legacies of colonialism affect discussion. Modern discoveries and excavations of Gandhara date to the 19th century and the 20th century, during the period of British rule in India. Soldiers, adventurers, and explorers such as Charles Mason sent back reports to the world about the finds from the 1800s onward. The archaeologists Alexander Cunningham and John Marshall were fascinated by Buddhism and South Asian culture, who also looked eagerly for connections between India and the world. Alexander the Great and his successors in the northwest frontier regions were an obsession for a number of these men. The scholarly emphasis on Dionysus and the Dionysiac thus seems to repeat predilections of colonial illustrations and explorers who valued Indian culture more, if it would somehow be associated with Greek or Roman antiquity, or who found it difficult to accept artistic innovation or accomplishment in South Asia. Gandhara, from such a vantage point, is a sign of the spread of Hellenism and of the remarkable reach of Greek ideas and practices. Gandharan art is valuable in its own right on this reading, but even more valuable because it reflects the instance of distant Hellas. Disentangling the study of Gandhara from the question of colonialism is no easy matter, however, since so much of what we know about the place comes from the excavations and writings of scholars who worked in the colonial era. We might also turn the question of colonialism on its head and say, that Gandharan artists were no less capable than any other sculptors at understanding and refashioning images of Dionysus to suit their own purposes. What we might want to emphasize is that Gandharan art is its own thing, and that it should not be judged for failing to conform to an external canon, whether Greek, Roman, or Parthian. Gandharan art conforms to no canons other than the canons of Gandharan art. The number of Gandharan works that reflect a Dionysiac tradition is very small in comparison to the many Gandharan sculptures which were produced. It's also true to say that the number of Gandharan sculptures that follow Parthian, Shaka, Kushan conventions or the traditions of Indian cultures to the south is very small. As the scholar Lolita Nehru, and that is her name, as the scholar Lolita Nehru remarks, the majority of Gandharan sculptures are characterized by a style which belongs to none of the parent traditions. The sculptures are a distinctive Gandharan creation, their style recognizable as an independent language. Dionysus plays, therefore, a small role in what appears to be a complex and wide-ranging phenomenon. We do not yet have theoretically nuanced models for understanding the art and region of Bactria and Gandhara in the Kushan period or earlier, and we cannot know now whether these artists and viewers were aware of Dionysus as a god or what they would have made of the connection between Dionysus and Alexander. Nor do we have an adequate grasp of their conceptions of divinity, representation, history, and translation. But we will, I think, find it useful to place Dionysus in a context where ideas and personnel flow in a vital and continuous manner between the Mediterranean and Gandhara, where each region made its own use of Dionysus and the Dionysiac. Lucian reminded his readers how Dionysus had been usurped for ideological and political purposes by Hellenistic and Roman rulers who sought to follow the example of Alexander. The soi-disant Indian triumph of Dionysus was of a piece with their military ambitions. In Greater Gandhara, artists were aiming not to dispatch Dionysus and his procession back to Greece, nor to capture the significance of his triumph. This is not to say that Gandharan art, with its Dionysiac features, served no ideological purpose. Among many other objects, the gold clasps remind us that they did. But Dionysus lived and moved in his own environment here, in Gandhara, whether drinking or dancing or looking after the dead in the afterlife, and he did not have to bring civilization to anyone. Thank you.